In July 2024, Northern California was engulfed in flames as the Park Fire erupted from Butte County, rapidly spreading through dry pine forests and remote valleys. Hot winds and harsh weather turned the blaze into an uncontrollable monster, forcing thousands to evacuate. In the small town of Paradise, once devastated by the 2018 Camp Fire, painful memories resurfaced. But this time, a group of people and animals came together to write a different story. Sarah Nguyen, a 29-year-old park ranger, was patrolling near Lassen National Forest when she received the fire alert. With experience from previous fire seasons, she knew the Park Fire was no ordinary blaze. She drove her Jeep, accompanied by her tamed Mustang, Storm, a gray horse she had rescued from the previous year's fire, to warn remote farms before the roads were blocked. When Sarah arrived at the Thompson farm, the smoke had already thickened, and flames licked the towering pines. The Thompson family, an elderly couple and their 2 young grandchildren, were desperately trying to herd their chickens and pigs into a pen to escape, but the fire had already surrounded the only road out. Sarah shouted, "Get in my Jeep, quick!" But her Jeep didn't have enough space for the whole family and their livestock. Just then, a flock of sparrows flew past, chirping loudly, drawing Sarah's attention to an old forest trail, a long-forgotten path that might lead through the valley to safety. Sarah tied Storm to the Jeep and handed the reins to Mr. Thompson. "Hold on to him, I'll lead the way." She ran ahead while Storm pulled the Jeep carrying the family and a few chickens they managed to grab. But the fire spread rapidly, and gusts of wind sent embers flying over their heads, igniting the brush on both sides of the path. Suddenly, a massive pine tree collapsed, blocking their route, its burning trunk forming a wall of flames. Sarah panicked, but Storm neighed and charged forward, using his front hooves to kick at the burning tree, pushing it aside despite the searing pain on his hooves. Just as they thought they had escaped, a terrifying sound echoed through the air, the howls of a pack of gray wolves, driven out of their dens by the fire. The wolves emerged from the forest, their eyes wild. But instead of attacking, the alpha wolf stopped, locking eyes with Sarah as if communicating. She realized they were also searching for a way out. Sarah shouted, "Follow me!" She led the group, humans, horse, and wolves, along the trail, relying on the wolves' instincts to avoid the fastest spreading flames. But their greatest challenge came when they reached a narrow ravine, the only way to the highway in safety. The fire had climbed the cliffs, and a massive boulder, cracked by the heat, had tumbled down, blocking their path. Sarah yelled, "We have to move it!" She and Mr. Thompson pushed with all their strength, but the boulder was too heavy. Suddenly, the wolves rushed in, using their collective strength to claw at the dirt beneath the rock, loosening it. Storm neighed and kicked the boulder with his hind legs, while Sarah and the family gave everything they had. With a thunderous crash, the boulder rolled down into the ravine, clearing their path to freedom. They raced through the ravine, the fire chasing close behind, reaching the highway just as the firefighting crews arrived. Sarah collapsed, embracing Storm, tears streaming down her face as she saw his hooves bleeding. The wolves stood at a distance, watching for a moment before turning back into the forest, vanishing like ghosts into the smoke. Mr. Thompson whispered, "My God, I've never seen anything like this." The Park Fire was finally contained after weeks of relentless effort, leaving Paradise with fresh scars. But the story of Sarah, Storm, and the wolves spread, becoming a symbol of survival in California. A wooden plaque was placed near the trail, depicting Sarah riding Storm with the wolves running beside them, inscribed with the words, "Friends under fire." Sarah continued her work as a ranger, with Storm always by her side, and from time to time, she would hear distant howls, a reminder that they would forever be comrades in that fire. Just as Sarah, the Thompson family, Storm, and the wolves reached the highway, believing they had escaped the nightmare of the Park Fire, a deep, thunderous sound suddenly shook the ground. From the valley behind them, thick black smoke billowed higher, accompanied by a series of small explosions. A firefighter shouted through a megaphone, "Gas field! There's an underground natural gas leak!" The fire had ignited an ancient methane pocket buried beneath the forest near Paradise, and the rising pressure was forcing it toward the surface. If it erupted in a massive explosion, the entire area, including the highway and the rescue teams, would be engulfed in fire and toxic fumes. Sarah turned back, her heart tightening. The firefighters were trying to drill vent holes from a distance, but they needed time, something the fire refused to give. She looked at Storm, his hooves still bleeding, then at the wolves standing silently behind her, their eyes sharp yet loyal. She whispered, "We have to do something." Mr. Thompson grabbed her hand. "You already saved us, Sarah. Don't go back." But Sarah shook her head. "If that gas pocket explodes, no one will survive." She leapt onto Storm's back, shouting, "Take me to the safest way, my friend!" Storm neighed and charged back into the burning forest, defying the thick smoke and searing heat. The wolves followed, the alpha leading the way through narrow paths only their wild instincts could sense. Sarah remembered a small stream nearby. If they could direct the methane toward the water, the explosion might be weakened. But to reach it, they had to cross a lowland area engulfed in flames. Flames roared on both sides as they ran, and a burning branch fell, singeing Storm's tail. The horse panicked, but Sarah clung tightly to his neck, whispering, "Stay calm, I'm here." The wolves rushed ahead, using their bodies to push burning branches out of the way. A young wolf yelped as fire scorched its paw, but it kept running. Sarah bit her lip, tears streaming as she witnessed their sacrifice. When they reached the stream, Sarah spotted a small fissure in the ground. Methane was leaking through, sending up wisps of white smoke with a sharp, acrid smell. She shouted, "Dig!" Storm struck the riverbank with his hooves, causing the soil to collapse, while the wolves clawed frantically, widening the crack to direct the gas into the water. Sarah jumped down, using her bare hands to pull away dirt and stones, coughing as toxic fumes burned her throat and blurred her vision. But time was running out. A small explosion rumbled from the fissure. Pressure was reaching its limit. Sarah screamed, "Run!" She shoved Storm and the wolves away, but the alpha wolf turned back, grabbing her jacket with its teeth and yanking her away just as a column of fire erupted from the ground. The methane ignited in the stream, but the combination of water and loosened soil had dampened the blast, turning what could have been a massive explosion into a smaller, contained fire, not strong enough to reach the highway. Sarah fell to the creekside, coughing up black smoke, clutching the alpha wolf tightly. Storm neighed, rushed over to lick her face, while the pack gathered around them, panting heavily. From a distance, the firefighters raced toward them, stunned by the sight. A woman, a horse, and a pack of wild wolves had stopped a catastrophe. Mr. Thompson ran to her, tears streaming down his face. "You are our angel, Sarah!" The park fire was finally extinguished after many days, leaving Northern California with deeper scars, but also with a story of hope. Sarah recovered in the hospital, Storm received special care for his burns, and the wolves returned to the forest. However, the alpha wolf often appeared near Sarah's ranger station, like a silent companion. The people of Paradise carved a relief into a stone near the creek, Sarah riding Storm, the wolves running beside them, with the words, "Courage under fire and smoke." Months later, Sarah stood on the hill, looking down at the valley, Storm by her side, his tail fur grown back despite the scars. She heard a distant howl and smiled. "Thank you, my friends. We survived together." Under the ashes of the park fire, they were proof that even in flames and toxic smoke, life still found a way. When Sarah, Storm, and the wolves managed to suppress the methane explosion beneath the creek, the firefighters quickly reached the area, deploying final measures to extinguish the remaining flames of the park fire. Sarah sat by the creek, exhausted, holding Storm, who was breathing heavily, his hooves bleeding and fur singed. The wolf pack gathered close, the alpha wolf licking the wounds of a younger one, its gaze both gentle and sharp. The Thompson family ran over, embracing Sarah as Mr. Thompson choked up. "You saved the whole town, not just us!" But the newfound peace was suddenly shattered by a terrifying hiss from deep within the forest. a firefighter shouted through the radio. "Underground fire! There's fire beneath the ground!" The park fire, with its lingering destruction, had silently spread through tree roots and dry peat underground, an often overlooked danger after large wildfires. This subterranean fire was now surging through cracks, threatening to turn the area around Paradise into a deadly trap, with toxic smoke and a sudden surge of heat from below. Sarah sprang to her feet, though her hands trembled and her breath was still labored from the smoke. She looked at the firefighters. "We have to find the underground fire before it spreads to the highway." But their thermal detection equipment had been damaged in the methane explosion, and time was running out. She turned to Storm and the wolves. "Can you help me one more time?" Storm let out a weak neigh and stood up, while the alpha wolf howled, leading the pack toward the smoke-filled forest. Sarah rode Storm, racing after the wolf pack through the charred trails, her eyes stinging from the smoke rising from the ground. The wolves, with their keen sense of smell, halted at a sunken patch of land where the earth had cracked, releasing waves of heat like the breath of a hidden beast. Sarah leapt down, feeling the faint tremor beneath her feet, a sign that the underground fire was nearing the surface. She shouted into her radio, "It's here! Bring water and shovels now!" But the firefighters were still hundreds of meters away, and the ground was splitting wider. A column of toxic smoke erupted, carrying small flames from the smoldering peat below, searing Storm's legs. The horse screamed in pain, collapsing, but Sarah rushed to him, pulling him away from the danger, tears streaming down her face. "Don't leave me, Storm!" The wolves howled and began digging frantically around the crack, trying to expose the underground fire so Sarah could act. She grabbed a half-burnt wooden branch, using it as a lever to pry open the ground, revealing a bed of glowing red peat smoldering beneath. With no water available, she used her bare hands to scoop cold earth from the creek's edge, throwing it over the hidden flames. The wolves dragged damp branches and wet soil, using their muzzles and paws to help her smother the fire. But the toxic smoke thickened, and a young wolf collapsed, unconscious from suffocation. The alpha wolf let out a mournful howl, urging the pack to retreat, but it remained beside Sarah, its gaze unwavering. At that moment, the ground trembled violently. The underground fire had reached a larger coal deposit, triggering an imminent eruption. Sarah screamed, "Run!" She shoved Storm and the alpha wolf away, but neither would leave. Summoning his last strength, Storm lunged forward, grabbing Sarah's jacket and pulling her onto his back. Meanwhile, the alpha wolf stood defiantly at the edge of the crack, howling as if challenging the fire itself. A pillar of flames exploded from the ground, engulfing the alpha wolf in an instant. But its sacrifice redirected the eruption, saving Sarah and Storm from certain death. Sarah tumbled from Storm's back, screaming, "No!" She rushed forward, but there was nothing left, only black smoke and ashes where the wolf had stood. Storm let out a mournful cry, kneeling beside her, while the remaining wolves howled in the distance, bidding farewell to their fallen leader. The firefighters finally arrived, pouring water and soil to extinguish the last remnants of the underground fire before it could spread further. They found Sarah clutching Storm by the creek, sobbing, her hands blistered and smoking from the burns. The park fire was finally contained, but at the cost of the alpha wolf's life. Sarah recovered in the hospital, with Storm by her side, though his leg remained braced for months. The wolves returned to the forest, now led by a fierce she-wolf, but they often lingered near the ranger station, as if honoring the hero who had fallen. The people of Paradise built a small monument, Sarah riding Storm, the alpha wolf standing before them, with the inscription, "From the ashes we live." A year later, Sarah stood on the old trail, watching the forest slowly come back to life. Storm limped beside her, and a distant howl echoed through the valley. She smiled and whispered, "Thank you, my friend. I won't forget." Beneath the ashes of the park fire, the bond between her, Storm, and the wolves remained a flame that would never die. After the alpha wolf sacrificed to halt the underground fire eruption, Sarah and Storm returned to the ranger station near Paradise, carrying both grief and silent gratitude. The firefighters had controlled most of the park fire, and late summer rains finally extinguished the last embers. Sarah sat beside Storm in a temporary stable, wrapping his injured leg, whispering, "You're all I have left, my friend." The remaining wolves had retreated deep into the forest, but their haunting howl still echoed every night, a lingering tribute to their fallen leader. But peace did not last. One morning, as Sarah was reviewing damage reports with the ranger team, the ground suddenly trembled, not a typical aftershock, but the warning of a new danger. A colleague ran in, panting. "Landslide! The fire weakened Feather Hill! The earth is collapsing!" The park fire, with its prolonged destruction, had burned away the tree roots and loosened the soil that held Feather Hill, a massive ridge west of Paradise. Now, thousands of tons of rock, scorched trees, and debris were sliding downward, threatening to bury the recently evacuated valley settlement and the highway, the town's last escape route. Sarah looked at Storm, her eyes flashing with determination. "We're not done yet!" She leaped onto Storm's back, despite his limp, and charged outside. Over the radio, she shouted, "I'll find a way to slow the landslide! Get everyone out now!" The rangers protested. "You're insane, Sarah! The rocks will crush you!" But she didn't listen, her voice firm. "I won't let Paradise fall again." On the way up Feather Hill, she heard a distant howl. The wolves had returned, now led by the she-wolf. They ran beside her, sensing this final threat. As she reached the hillside, the sight before her froze her in place. A massive wall of earth and rock, swallowing burnt trees and billowing smoke, was crashing down with terrifying speed. The roaring of the landslide drowned out all other sounds, and dust choked the sky. Sarah screamed, "We have to slow it down!" She spotted an old trench near the base of the hill. If they could divert the landslide into it, its force would be weakened. She spurred Storm forward, searching for large rocks to create a barrier. The wolves followed, using their claws and bodies to shove charred logs into the trench, forming a crude blockade. Storm neighed, gripping a large tree limb with his teeth, even as his legs trembled from pain. But the landslide was too strong. A massive boulder rolled down, heading straight for Sarah. Storm lunged forward, pushing her out of its path, but the rock clipped his side, sending him crashing to the ground with a pained cry. Sarah screamed, "Storm!" She ran to him, cradling his body, tears spilling as she saw blood seeping from his flank. The wolves howled and threw themselves into the landslide, using their strength to knock smaller rocks aside, redirecting the flow. Sarah staggered to her feet, her hands shaking. "Keep going!" she yelled. She and the wolves dug into the earth, hurling rocks into the trench, forcing the landslide to veer away from the valley. But the debris kept coming, and a massive log tumbled toward them. The she-wolf leaped, slamming into it midair, knocking it aside, but the force dragged her into the collapsing mass of earth. Sarah screamed, "No!" But she didn't stop. She wrapped her arms around Storm, pulling him up, while the remaining wolves fought with everything they had. At last, the landslide diverted into the trench, its power fading as it crashed into the natural barrier of earth and timber. When the dust settled, Sarah collapsed beside Storm, holding him tightly, whispering, "You did it, my friend!" The surviving wolves howled mournfully, honoring the fallen she-wolf. The firefighters and rangers arrived, stunned to see that Sarah, Storm, and the wolves had stopped the final disaster of the park fire. Paradise was saved again, but at the cost of the she-wolf's sacrifice. Sarah and Storm recovered slowly, spending hours together as she nursed his wounds, her gaze always drifting toward the forest. The wolf pack, now only a few, still lingered near the ranger station, silent companions. The townspeople erected a larger monument, Sarah riding Storm, the alpha wolf and the she-wolf standing on either side, with the inscription, "Unyielding beneath ash and stone." A year later, Sarah stood atop Feather Hill, now covered in fresh green grass. Storm, scarred but strong, walked beside her. A distant howl echoed through the valley, and she smiled. "We're a team. Forever." Beneath the ashes and rubble of the park fire, they remained proof that unity could overcome all adversity, fire, gas, or landslide.